When you think giant monster movie, what comes to mind? Do you think of Godzilla? King Kong? Maybe even Jaws? Many people assume that 1954's Godzilla is the father of what would become the Tokusatsu genre. Others point to King Kong from 1933. As valuable and shaping as these films were, both guesses are incorrect. The oldest ancestor of giant monster movies is actually The Lost World from 1925, a silent film about dinosaurs and monsters living hidden away from humans in a secret plateau in the southern hemisphere. So, this begs the question. How did we get from silent clay dinosaurs to giant possessed metal CGI dragons? What do monsters have to do with our culture? Are cheesy monster movies even important? Now, dear viewer, evolution for the tokusatsu genre has been very long and very difficult. Fortunately for you, it isn't all that boring. In 1925, production began on The Lost World, which was to be an adaptation of Arthur Conan Doyle's 1912 novel of the same name. Hired to bring the stars of the film to life was special effects master Willis O'Brien. His work was highly advanced and he was quite talented. The success of The Lost World helped further elevate O'Brien's status as an animator, and he'd go on to create one of the most beloved monsters ever put to film, none other than the legendary King Kong in the Giant Apes debut movie released in 1933. King Kong was an immediate success, quickly becoming one of the most well-known giant monster movies in the world. A young man by the name of Ray Harryhausen, inspired by Willis O'Brien's craftsmanship in King Kong, began to study anatomy and the art of stop motion. After meeting his idol, Harryhausen continued to develop his craft and became well known for his talent. Using the skills he'd learned from O'Brien, Harryhausen would go on to create his very own stop-motion monster films, the first of which was 1953's The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, a science fiction story about the rampage of Harryhausen's creation, the Redosaurus. It was the first movie where Harryhausen was credited as the sole special effects director, and much like The Lost World and King Kong before it, it was a smash hit in theaters. The tokusatsu genre wasn't only enjoyed by Americans, however, though you might have guessed that by its name. A lost film by the name of The Great Buddha Arrival is the oldest known Japanese giant monster movie. Unfortunately, all copies of it were either destroyed during the firebombings of Tokyo during World War II or left to rot by the studio that owned them. Though it's not known how well the public received the movie, it still deserves its place in the Tokusatsu Hall of Fame. As many of you may know, 1954 is probably the most important year for Japanese kaiju films. The thundering release of Gojira, directed by Ishiro Honda, forever changed the landscape of film. Known by his English name, Godzilla was heavily inspired by the Redosaurus, King Kong, and many other famous monsters. Although Ishiro Honda and special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya initially wanted to use stop motion to bring their monster to life, budgeting restrictions placed on their studio, Toho, forced them to develop what is now known as suitimation, where a large costume is worn by a suit actor and miniatures are used to portray cities and other locations. Gojira's story was a direct reflection of Japanese attitudes following World War II. The most influential events in its production were the firebombings of Tokyo and the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Still, a slightly lesser-known influence was the Lucky Dragon No. 5 incident of 1954. When the American military performed nuclear tests in Bikini Atoll without informing any of the island's or Japan's public, a fishing boat named the Lucky Dragon 5 and its crew were engulfed in the fallout of said testing. Unfortunately, the crew was not aware of this until well after they had returned to the mainland with their fish and sold them on the market. One member of the crew, Kubuyama Aikichi, would succumb to radiation sickness later that year as a result of this incident. I have a kind of hatred of nuclear weapons. It's horrifying to make such terrible weapons and use them on one city and then another. It was that feeling for me as the director that meant I didn't hesitate one bit to make Godzilla come alive in the film, stated Ishiro Honda in a 1990 Directors Guild of Japan interview. The Japanese public, still dealing with the fresh wounds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was furious. These events are reflected in Gojira's somber depictions of citywide destruction, death, and the helplessness of Japanese citizens. According to several accounts, people in cinemas shed tears at the bleak sight. Godzilla's usage of science fiction to relay the despair of Japan and the dangers of nuclear weapons hit home with people across the world. As beautiful as it was, Gojira was deemed too Japanese to be shown in most international theaters by non-Japanese producers. Just like the Americans had occupied Japan following the war and monitored their, well, everything, Gojira 2 received a healthy Americanization in 1956 starring Raymond Burr. Most of the nuclear symbolism and emotional narrative were wiped completely, resulting in a somewhat butchered, standard monster movie. Other than Godzilla, King of the Monsters, the altered Gojira, Them was another big-name monster movie released in 1954. Coincidentally, it also dealt with the consequences of radiation, albeit in a more lighthearted fashion, considering giant ants are the subject. Small tangent, but what is it with giant radioactive bugs? Apparently, the 50s and 60s were full of them. There's tarantula, the deadly mantis, and the black scorpion, just to name a few. I guess they were a pressing threat to the American public. Despite its doctoring overseas, Godzilla had already received a sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, in 1955. This trend would continue, with 13 movies following the first two in quick succession until 1975. Funnily enough, Godzilla's third film would pit him against the monster that was responsible for much of his creation, King Kong. 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla released to massive fanfare, skyrocketing Godzilla to fame in the States and becoming the most attended Godzilla film until the smash hit of Godzilla Minus One in 2023. Calm down, folks. I know you're excited, but we still have a bit before we get there. What is now known as the Showa era of Godzilla films, stretching from 1954 to 1975, is considered the golden era of Tokusatsu. If you've seen any of the older Godzilla movies, it's probably from this era. However, it wasn't just Godzilla succeeding during the Showa era. Daiei Films' Gamera, a series of 12 films focused on a heroic, giant, radioactive flying turtle, were a fierce competitor in the Japanese movie market. North Korea, South Korea, and the UK were all getting in on the fun with their own monsters, Pulgasari, Yongari, and the giant behemoth, respectively. Around the world, people were absolutely enamored with kaiju. But why? In today's world, it can be difficult to realize the impact monsters have had on our culture. Kaiju films are a lens through which we can see the true fears of humans across the globe solidified. As silly as some of them can seem, monsters can be the perfect representation of more abstract problems, ranging from pollution and corrupt sciences to Cold War tensions. In 2014, Jay Short wrote, "What makes science fiction so powerful is its inherent capacity, whether or not this capacity is wisely employed is up to the artist, to give us perspective on our social context. We can only derive a fictional world from the rearrangement of elements of our own. And thus, the act of creating a science fiction text involves extracting the stuff of our world and projecting it outwards in a new form. In its better formulations, this results in a subtle shifting of our perspective of our own world, rather than a mere clever production of a new one." Mr. Short perfectly encapsulates the core value of monster movies. King Kong was born from the selfish desires of colonialism. The Rhedosaurus retaliates against illegal nuclear tests. Godzilla is the grotesque son of the atom bomb. Each of the monsters under the wide Tokusatsu umbrella represents a unique issue in its most extreme form. On the one hand, it's a silly man in a rubber suit. On the other hand, it's a way to process these fears that are mostly bottled up, says J.J. Abrams in the Cloverfield interview. And yet, there is still a bright side. Despite all of that, who are giant monster movies most commonly associated with? Children. Personally, I've been a kaiju fan since I was a literal infant, and I can tell you it wasn't because of the deep emotional undertones. Kids love to see monsters destroying cities, fighting each other, and doing silly stuff. Around the world, kids share their love for Godzilla, Gamera, and so many other monsters. As the Showa era progressed, kaiju films began to be exclusively geared towards children, harboring messages of understanding, friendship, and compassion. Movies like 1965's Gamera promote environmental kindness. Children's television series Ultraman is the best example of kids' monster media, in my opinion. Ultraman compresses complex issues like environmental damage into easier-to-digest 25-minute episodes. Not only are monster movies important metaphors for real-life tragedies, but they bind us together both through their anchors to reality and their penchant for insane sci-fi silliness. Fortunately for us, monster movies didn't stop coming out in 1975. The Godzilla franchise survives to this day, boasting an impressive and ever-growing collection of 38 movies and 7 shows. Gamera received a trilogy in the late 90s and a 3D animated Netflix series, as did Ultraman. King Kong lends his name to 13 of his own films, along with 4 TV shows. The critically acclaimed dinosaur classic Jurassic Park continues to produce popular content today. The generation of star-studded monsters we know so well have inspired hundreds of films just like them. In 2008, Studio Bad Robot released Cloverfield, a masterpiece of found-footage kaiju horror set in New York. Ironically, the style and tone of Cloverfield would heavily influence Legendary Studios' Godzilla in 2014. Cloverfield is a gritty, dour monster flick that captures the horrifying imagery of 9/11 through its camera and set work. I felt chills run down my spine watching it for the first time as the city streets were flooded with the smoke and ash of collapsing buildings. In 2023, Godzilla Minus One exploded into theaters worldwide. The crushing, horrific new take on Godzilla's appearance during World War II, as opposed to 10 years later, tackles many subjects the original did not. The rebuilding of Japan immediately following the war, the social consequences of returning home as a survivor, the trauma and fear of facing a threat so similar to the atomic bombs in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Modern monster movies tell their own stories, just like those that came before them. Every country, every person on Earth has their own monster. There's one for all of us, whether that be Clover, Kiryu, or Pulgasari, or if you're super cool like me, Titanosaurus. The simple truth of the matter is, the tokusatsu genre has raised generations of fans across the globe, connecting us all with a greater purpose, to appreciate giant monsters. No, for real though, kaiju movies have been instrumental in developing and maintaining film industries for decades. They represent the good, the bad, and everything in between about humanity. We should give them a little more credit for that. Thanks for watching. This was basically just an excuse to nerd out about my favorite topic in the whole world, so thanks for sticking around. See you next time.